Imagine being targeted by the neighborhood's self-proclaimed queen, only to find her true arrogance hits when her own child crosses a line. She called the cops over a grocery dispute, never realizing she picked the wrong person to mess with. What happened next would shock the entire HOA. The suburban streets glistened under the late afternoon sun, the kind of streets where every lawn was trimmed to perfection and every mailbox stood at attention. Houses mirrored each other in design, yet each homeowner carried a silent pride, a private stake in maintaining appearances. Among them, Karen had long established herself as a local authority. Not a real authority, mind you, but a self-appointed enforcer of decorum, a keeper of rules no one else seemed to care about. Every neighborhood barbecue, every street meeting, she was there, clipboard in hand, watching, judging, and whispering in circles that were far too tight for comfort. I had just moved in a few months ago, a fact that Karen seemed unable to forget or forgive. Unlike her, I carried a reputation from past ventures that demanded respect. A subtle aura followed me, one that Karen could not see clearly at first but would soon learn to fear. The streets were quiet, the sky stretched in calm shades of gold and pink, but I could sense the undercurrents of scrutiny following me, the invisible gaze of someone who believed she ruled more than just her home. She didn't know that beneath my calm exterior, a calculating mind evaluated every move she made, every judgment she passed. It started innocuously enough, a minor interaction that spiraled beyond any reasonable expectation. Her son, a brat fueled by entitlement and his mother's lack of restraint, had approached me one afternoon. A simple request, or, more accurately, a demand, of groceries from my bag sent ripples through what should have been a mundane suburban afternoon. He didn't ask politely, he assumed compliance. He didn't realize the danger of such assumptions. Karen appeared moments later, her steps hurried yet deliberately composed. She projected control, a force field of supposed authority over her child, over me, over the neighborhood. But the tension she radiated was palpable. Something told me she had no clue that I was not the neighbor she thought she could intimidate. While she fumed, I stood still, groceries in hand, assessing her and her son. Her control slipped with every second, and I could almost taste the fear that hovered beneath her calm exterior. Little did she know, this small confrontation was about to unleash a storm far bigger than any HOA complaint could contain. By the time her voice reached its highest pitch, the air itself seemed to tighten. Her son backed away slightly, sensing the impending escalation, yet Karen's pride refused to allow retreat. And just like that, she did the unthinkable, she called the cops. Over groceries. Over entitlement. A suburban drama had officially begun, but Karen could not yet fathom the role reversal she was about to face. The scene froze for a moment, a prelude to chaos. The police response would come, yes, but not in the way she imagined. Little did Karen know, I had been trained to handle such intrusions with precision. Subtle power dynamics were about to shift, and the quiet street, usually a haven of order, was about to witness a disruption that would leave every resident talking for months. The chapter of confrontation had just begun, and Karen's unawareness of her opponent's true nature would cost her dearly. The suburban battlefield had been drawn, and I was more than ready for the skirmish to come. The wail of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, an intrusion that signaled the official arrival of authority. Karen's eyes lit up with triumph, the smug satisfaction of someone who believed their moral high ground was unquestionable. She pointed, gestured, and narrated the scenario as if the officers were merely audience members in her suburban performance. I remained calm, groceries in hand, letting the drama unfold. Experience had taught me that escalation worked best when patience guided every move. The cops approached, professional yet cautious, trying to parse the absurdity of the call. Karen's story spilled out. Her son, my groceries, a perceived threat. Every word she used was designed to paint me as the antagonist. Every detail, exaggerated. Every pause, calculated to draw sympathy. But I was prepared. My reputation, though silent, preceded me. A history of handling entitlement and confrontation with methodical precision gave me an edge no one in this quiet street could anticipate. As Karen delivered her version, I allowed the cops a moment to process reality, the reality that her version was far from the truth. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her rising agitation, and it became evident that the scales of authority were about to tip. Karen's son, once the center of her world, now seemed uncertain. He sensed the shift before his mother did, a subtle tremor in her posture betraying the cracks in her armor. As officers began their neutral questioning, Karen's narrative faltered. Her confidence, once unshakable, wavered under the weight of scrutiny. Every accusation she made was countered by my composed explanation, highlighting entitlement and overreach rather than malice. Neighbors began to peek from their windows, the suburban silence shattered. Phones came out, recording the spectacle. Social media feeds would later light up with snippets of Karen's meltdown, though she could not yet know it. The cops, realizing this was not a criminal matter, tried to mediate. Yet the humiliation Karen experienced was only beginning. She realized, perhaps too late, that the quiet person she had underestimated was not only defending herself but subtly dismantling her perceived authority. Her gestures became frantic, her words sharper but less convincing. The officers, politely restraining laughter and maintaining protocol, documented statements while Karen's sense of control disintegrated. I stood still, observing the unraveling. Groceries clutched yet secondary to the satisfaction of watching power dynamics shift in real time. By the time the officers concluded, Karen was left with nothing but her fury, her son's uneasy glances, and the realization that calling the cops had not delivered victory. Instead, it had exposed her arrogance, her overreach, and her inability to predict the consequences of underestimating someone's position in the unspoken social hierarchy of entitlement. By the following morning, the neighborhood was buzzing in a way that only suburban drama could ignite. Word traveled faster than the sun's rays on a bright street. Every whisper, every sidelong glance, carried the story of Karen's police call. It started with a casual mention at the community mailbox, spread to gardening discussions, and finally reached the well-manicured lawns of every neighbor who had ever been subjected to Karen's self-appointed rulings. The chaos that began with Groceries had now transformed into a social spectacle, a drama that the neighborhood had been unknowingly waiting for. The subtlety of suburban power lies in perception. Karen had always relied on that perception, projecting authority through eye rolls, clipped instructions, and a smug assumption that her word was law. Yet the incident with the cops disrupted that carefully maintained illusion. It wasn't just a matter of a grocery dispute anymore, it was evidence of Karen's overreach, her inability to anticipate consequences, and, crucially, her miscalculation in underestimating me. Neighbors who had once nodded politely to her pronouncements now glanced at her with hesitation, and some even whispered with barely concealed amusement. The morning was crisp, the kind that encourages quiet walks and casual conversations. Yet beneath the calm veneer, tension simmered. Karen walked the streets, clipboard clutched as always, but her strides had lost a fraction of their usual authority. Eyes followed her, not in fear but in curiosity. She tried to issue subtle commands to neighbors trimming their hedges or jogging their dogs, but her tone faltered, betrayed by the memory of the previous day. The same neighbors she once commanded with silent intimidation now watched her carefully, assessing her words for cracks, for signs of weakness, for glimpses of vulnerability. And every crack, every hesitation, only magnified her embarrassment. Meanwhile, I moved about my own day with calculated ease. Grocery bags now rested in my pantry, their presence a quiet, unspoken symbol of a confrontation won without a single shout. My interactions with neighbors remained friendly, casual, yet carried a weight that Karen could not comprehend. Every nod of acknowledgement from a passerby, every polite smile, subtly reinforced my position. The contrast between her desperation and my calm composure was not lost on anyone paying attention. It wasn't aggression that won the street's attention, it was controlled authority, a silent command that required no loud declarations. By noon, Karen's whispers to her son revealed an escalating frustration that mirrored her public humiliation. She replayed every moment, dissecting my posture, my words, my calm demeanor. Her son, now aware that his initial demand had triggered an escalation far beyond his understanding, began to question the wisdom of following her lead. The seeds of doubt had been planted, not just in the neighborhood, but within her own family unit. Suburban authority, after all, is fragile. Once challenged, the collapse can be as dramatic as a well-timed fireworks display, spectacular and impossible to ignore. Across the street, a group of neighbors gathered in the shade of a large oak, their murmurs filled with amusement, curiosity, and subtle admiration. Stories of Karen's past exaggerations and petty rulings were interwoven with the current saga, creating a narrative that painted her in an increasingly ridiculous light. It was no longer about groceries, it was about entitlement, control, and the consequences of misjudging the wrong neighbor. I observed from my porch, silently noting the social currents, aware that perception in this microcosm of suburban life was as powerful as law or rules. Every glance Karen received now carried judgment, a subtle, almost imperceptible verdict rendered by those who had once obeyed without question. The HOA itself, a council of self-important homeowners, soon became a secondary battleground. Emails circulated, innocuous on the surface, but loaded with innuendo and subtle references to the incident. Meeting schedules shifted, ostensibly to discuss community improvements, yet every agenda item became a potential stage for Karen to assert control, or to falter spectacularly. I watched with interest, noting the undercurrents of tension, the careful diplomacy practiced by neighbors who had learned to navigate her presence without directly confronting her. The community's social fabric, previously held together by politeness and fear, now wavered in the face of an unexpected disruption. By evening, the climax of the day approached. Karen, convinced she could restore some semblance of control, attempted to gather her allies, neighbors who had previously shown loyalty or fear. She spoke in hushed tones, gesturing, emphasizing the perceived threat of my actions, the audacity of someone standing up to her. Yet even in these private conversations, doubt crept in. Some nodded politely but offered no real allegiance, others avoided her gaze entirely. The subtle isolation of a self-appointed queen was a dramatic sight, and one that quietly pleased those of us observing from the sidelines. It was during this fragile calm that I chose to make a small, calculated gesture. A simple interaction, a smile to a neighbor as I watered my plants, a nod of acknowledgement, nothing overt or loud. Yet the effect was immediate. Whispers grew into small conversations, laughter edged into anecdotes about the previous day, and social momentum subtly shifted. Karen's son watched from a distance, a silent witness to his mother's faltering authority and my quiet consolidation of influence. Even children, sensitive to undercurrents of power, began to see the cracks in what once seemed an unshakable maternal fortress. The night brought no resolution, only anticipation. Karen retreated to her home, the kind of retreat fueled by frustration and denial. She replayed every detail, analyzing every possible course of action, yet failing to predict the subtle ways in which the neighborhood's perception had already shifted. Social media notifications pinged quietly, neighbors sharing details of the confrontation with playful embellishments, turning what should have been a minor suburban incident into a story with viral potential. Karen did not yet understand that in the age of instant sharing, perception and reputation could spread faster than any authority figure could react. As the street lights flickered on, casting elongated shadows across manicured lawns, a sense of anticipation lingered in the air. Something larger was brewing, a confrontation that had grown far beyond groceries or even a phone call to the police. The battle lines were drawn, but the players were unaware of the subtle shifts in power dynamics. Karen, armed with pride but now weakened by embarrassment, planned her next moves. Yet she underestimated the influence of calm control, of silent observation, and of strategic social positioning. The chapter closed with the quiet hum of a neighborhood on edge, a calm before a storm only I could see coming. Every neighbor had been given a front-row seat to a transformation in suburban hierarchy, a lesson in entitlement and authority, and Karen remained oblivious to the true forces at play. The streets, the lawns, the whispers, they were all pieces of a puzzle only I could solve, and the pieces were moving in my favor. The morning sunlight pierced through the suburban blinds, casting neat lines across freshly waxed floors and manicured lawns. In every house, life went on with the polished monotony typical of the neighborhood, yet beneath that calm lay the simmering tension of a feud that no one could ignore. Karen, now fully aware that her authority had been publicly challenged, was preparing her next move. The grocery incident was no longer just a private embarrassment, it had become a matter of principle, a perceived affront to the rules she believed governed both her household and the entire street. Her fingers hovered over her computer keyboard, drafting a formal HOA complaint that would paint me as a neighborhood menace. Every word she typed was loaded with indignation, every sentence carefully constructed to create an official record of what she considered unacceptable behavior. But even as she wrote, her mind replayed the events of the past days, the smirk on my face, the way neighbors subtly acknowledged me, and the whispers that had spread like wildfire across the community. Each memory gnawed at her confidence, highlighting the difference between perception and reality, between her imagined power and the social dynamics that now worked against her. Meanwhile, I observed quietly, my movements casual yet intentional. I was aware of the complaint being drafted, of the careful plotting that consumed Karen's days, yet I did nothing to interrupt her process. Experience had taught me that control often works best when invisible, when opponents expend their energy against themselves rather than directly against you. The neighborhood, meanwhile, continued to shift subtly. Conversations at fences, over morning coffees, and in the shade of trees began to include indirect references to Karen's misjudgment. Her authority, once unquestioned, was becoming fodder for social commentary, the kind that spreads in whispered tones but has long-lasting consequences. By mid-morning, the complaint had been submitted. The HOA board received it with the polite formality typical of such institutions, yet the undercurrents of disbelief were unmistakable. Members who had long admired or feared Karen found themselves questioning the legitimacy of her claims. The incident had escalated from groceries to formal allegations of intimidation and disruptive behavior. Every word, every accusation, now carried the weight of a bureaucratic process, yet it also revealed Karen's desperation. The difference between authority and entitlement had never been clearer. As the day progressed, I made a point of attending to my own household chores, each movement deliberate and visible. Neighbors passing by observed the calm control, noting the difference between my composed demeanor and Karen's increasingly frantic plotting. It was not aggression that shifted the social balance, but a quiet, confident presence that contrasted sharply with her growing tension. The neighborhood had begun to take note, and subtle alliances formed without anyone saying a word. Observers, once loyal to Karen out of fear or habit, now hesitated, unsure which side to align with, and that hesitation was powerful. By late afternoon, whispers became conversations, conversations became subtle interventions, and interventions hinted at potential disruptions to Karen's influence. Some neighbors quietly expressed doubt about her complaint, questioning whether it was appropriate to involve the HOA over what seemed like trivial matters. Others noted that the escalation, far from enforcing order, had exposed Karen's fragility. Her son, once an instrument of her authority, now seemed conflicted, torn between loyalty to his mother and the recognition that the world she claimed to control was shifting under his feet. Karen, sensing the tide turning, attempted a public demonstration of authority. She walked the streets with a clipboard, attempting to lecture neighbors on proper conduct and community standards. Yet her speeches fell flat. Words that once inspired acquiescence now elicited polite nods at best and quiet smirks at worst. The contrast between her intent and the neighborhood's reception was palpable. Her attempts at intimidation no longer carried weight, they were background noise in a community that had begun to perceive her as a flawed, overreaching figure rather than the enforcer she imagined herself to be. I watched from a distance, a careful observer of the unraveling spectacle. Each of Karen's gestures, each attempt to assert control, played into a narrative I had already begun to shape. Power, I understood, was not about confrontation alone, it was about perception, about shaping reality subtly so that others participate willingly in the hierarchy you create. While Karen exerted effort to manufacture authority, I allowed influence to accrue naturally, quietly, and convincingly. The difference was stark, one relied on fear and posturing, the other on calm, consistent presence and strategic observation. As evening approached, the HOA board scheduled an emergency session to review Karen's complaint. The meeting, held in the community clubhouse, was designed to project order and seriousness, yet the tension in the room suggested otherwise. Members listened politely as Karen recounted her grievances, but subtle glances, half-smiles, and whispered side conversations revealed the truth. Her credibility had been undermined, not just by me but by the way she had overextended her authority. The room, intended to reinforce her influence, now served as a stage for her unraveling. By the time I arrived at the meeting, observers noticed my presence immediately. The air shifted subtly. I did not need to speak, my calm composure, my mere presence, contrasted sharply with Karen's anxious energy. Her complaints, while meticulously prepared, seemed almost trivial in comparison to the authority conveyed by silent confidence. HOA members, bound by rules but influenced by perception, weighed the complaint against both my demeanor and the growing neighborhood consensus. Subtle nods, polite attentiveness, and occasional eyebrow raises communicated what words could not. Karen's narrative was losing traction. The meeting concluded without decisive action, leaving Karen frustrated and isolated. She had mobilized formal channels, attempted to assert dominance, and yet the outcome reinforced her diminished authority. Neighbors, once hesitant to challenge her, now observed with a growing sense of empowerment. Social norms, rather than legal authority, had become the true measure of influence in the neighborhood, and Karen had misjudged the balance entirely. As night fell, the suburban streets were quieter, yet the energy of the day lingered. Karen retreated to her home, frustrated and plotting, while the community collectively exhaled, sensing a subtle but irreversible shift. The drama, far from over, had entered a new stage, one in which her strategies would become increasingly desperate, and my calculated restraint would continue to consolidate influence. The streets, the whispers, and the social currents of the neighborhood had already begun to realign. And as I closed my blinds and prepared for the evening, I knew the next moves would be crucial. Karen's attempts to reclaim control would escalate, her ego and entitlement leaving her blind to the strategies unfolding around her. Yet I remained patient, aware that the true battle was not fought in formal complaints or loud confrontations, but in the subtle, persistent shift of perception and social power. The neighborhood had settled into a peculiar quiet, the kind that always comes before an inevitable storm. What appeared to outsiders as serene suburbia was, in reality, a simmering battlefield of social influence and calculated strategy. Karen's complaint, which she had hoped would cement her dominance, had instead become a lightning rod for scrutiny and subtle ridicule. The HOA, normally a bastion of procedural formalities, had unwittingly become the stage for a slow-motion unraveling, and the neighborhood had taken notice. Karen, unwilling to accept the quiet humiliation, began plotting her next move with meticulous precision. She studied the HOA rules as if they were sacred texts, searching for any clause, any fine print that could be leveraged against me. Every meeting agenda, every policy, every historical precedent was combed through with obsessive determination. She saw rules not as structures meant for fairness, but as weapons she could wield, believing that bureaucracy could restore her fractured authority. I observed from my porch, groceries long since put away, coffee in hand, allowing the narrative to unfold while remaining strategically silent. My role was not to confront but to position. I had already established a presence in the neighborhood that was quiet, unassailable, and grounded in calm authority. Karen's attempts to weaponize the HOA rules, however, created the perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate the difference between entitlement and true influence. The next HOA meeting arrived, held in the community clubhouse under the guise of routine review. In reality, it had become the arena for a clash of social hierarchy versus bureaucratic power. Karen entered with her usual air of superiority, documents neatly stacked, ready to present her case with all the dramatic flair she could muster. She began to cite clauses, interpret rules in her favor, and frame every minor inconvenience as a significant violation. Every word was designed to intimidate, to coerce the board into siding with her. Yet the room's energy had shifted. Eyes that once followed her obediently now darted between her and me, reading our silent standoff, questioning the legitimacy of her theatrics. The HOA board, composed of well-meaning but cautious neighbors, listened politely. They nodded, took notes, and occasionally asked questions, but each inquiry subtly exposed the limitations of Karen's claims. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her escalating frustration. While she presented her arguments with growing intensity, I allowed my silence to do the talking. The room noticed, the members sensing a composure that Karen could not fake. Authority, it became clear, was not in the documents she wielded, but in the quiet confidence that demanded respect without demanding submission. Karen, sensing the subtle shift, intensified her campaign. She introduced evidence she believed would sway opinions, photographs, anecdotal accounts, neighborhood gossip, and carefully worded descriptions of my alleged behavior. Yet the effect was the opposite of what she intended. Her evidence was scrutinized, dissected, and subtly questioned. The more she pushed, the more the room recognized her overreach, her desperation. Every attempt to weaponize rules backfired, reinforcing the narrative of entitlement rather than legitimate authority. Neighbors who had been previously neutral or silently amused began to engage more actively, offering polite but pointed observations that undercut Karen's claims. Some referenced community standards that she had herself ignored, subtly highlighting the hypocrisy. Others questioned the relevance of her complaints, emphasizing reason and fairness over personal grievance. The room's energy shifted from polite formality to cautious alignment with the person who embodied calm, grounded authority, me. Karen's carefully crafted plan began to crumble, each argument exposed as a veneer of control without substance. Her son, witnessing the escalation from a distance, seemed increasingly uneasy. He had begun to realize that his mother's authority, once unquestioned, was being dismantled not through aggression but through social perception and careful observation. The lessons were subtle yet powerful. True influence is earned, not demanded, and entitlement carries consequences when wielded recklessly. The subtle rebellion of the neighborhood, quietly aligning through whispers and polite interventions, spoke louder than any complaint she could file. By mid-meeting, Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. She began speaking over others, repeating points already addressed, and gesturing emphatically to regain control. But each attempt only exposed her inability to read the room, her over-reliance on formal rules as a substitute for genuine authority. Her words became louder, her tone sharper, but her effectiveness diminished. The contrast between her rising panic and my composed observation became stark, a visual lesson in the difference between entitlement and earned influence. Subtle alliances began to form around me, though no one spoke overtly about loyalty. Glances, nods, and quiet acknowledgments indicated an unspoken understanding. The social balance had shifted. Karen's network of influence, built on fear and habitual compliance, was fracturing under scrutiny and reasoned observation. Each neighbor's decision to question her authority quietly reinforced my position without confrontation, an elegant demonstration of power through perception rather than aggression. The meeting concluded with no immediate resolution, leaving Karen in visible distress. Her attempts to weaponize HOA rules had failed spectacularly, exposing not only her limitations but also the fragility of the social order she had sought to manipulate. Neighbors dispersed, their conversations filled with muted amusement and subtle acknowledgement of the shift in hierarchy. The HOA, intended as a tool of formal authority, had inadvertently highlighted the difference between entitlement and genuine influence. As night fell, the neighborhood streets glimmered under soft lamplight. Karen retreated to her home, her mind consumed with strategies for reclaiming authority, unaware that her efforts had only strengthened my position further. The social currents, once aligned with fear and habit, had subtly moved toward recognition of real composure and quiet influence. The neighborhood, now engaged in a silent realignment, had witnessed the power of calculated restraint over manufactured authority. I closed my door, reflecting on the day's events. Karen's attempts to weaponize rules, while aggressive, revealed more about her than about me. Each overreach, each desperate appeal, reinforced the lesson that power is not in titles, documents, or performative authority, it is in the ability to command respect through composure, strategy, and perception. The stage was set for the final confrontation, one that would test Karen's ego, the neighborhood's loyalty, and the subtle influence that had quietly solidified over days of observation. By the end of the night, a sense of anticipation lingered. The HOA, the neighbors, and even Karen herself were unknowingly participants in a social chess game. The rules she had hoped to use as weapons were now pawns in a much larger strategy, one that leveraged perception, patience, and subtle influence. Karen's next moves would be desperate, and the neighborhood, fully awake to the dynamics at play, would be watching every step. The chapter closed on a quiet street humming with anticipation. Karen's ego, fragile and untested in the face of true authority, prepared for its final test, unaware that the neighborhood's eyes were no longer blind to her overreach. The chessboard was set, the players defined, and the endgame approaching rapidly. The morning air was unusually crisp, carrying a tension that seemed to vibrate across the entire street. Suburban calm had become a distant memory. Every lawn, every mailbox, every carefully manicured garden now stood as silent witnesses to a social battle that had quietly escalated over days. Karen, aware that her previous efforts had failed, was determined to reclaim authority by any means necessary. Yet, her desperation had blinded her to the subtle networks of influence already aligned against her. The HOA had called a special meeting under the guise of community safety and protocol, but in reality, it had become the arena for the final confrontation. The community clubhouse buzzed with anticipation, neighbors whispered in small clusters, each conversation layered with curiosity, amusement, and a sense of foreboding. Cameras were out, phones poised to capture every gesture, every dramatic expression. The suburban stage was set, and Karen, unaware of how far perception had shifted, entered with the same confidence that had previously carried her unquestioned authority. Her entrance was theatrical, a clipboard in hand, a posture that radiated self-assurance. She expected deference, compliance, and the silent fear that had once followed her steps. Instead, she was met with a quiet awareness, a subtle acknowledgement from the community that something had changed. Every glance, every hesitant nod, conveyed the unspoken truth: the neighborhood was no longer under her sway. Her words, intended to intimidate, carried less weight than she imagined. I arrived shortly after, my presence deliberate and calm. No dramatic gestures, no posturing, just quiet authority. The difference was palpable. The room's energy shifted immediately. Eyes that once darted toward Karen for guidance now assessed her, then returned to me, reading the silent confidence I conveyed. Authority, it became obvious, did not belong to the loudest voice in the room, but to the one whose presence demanded attention without aggression. Karen began her presentation, her voice sharp, words carefully chosen to frame me as a disruptive force in the neighborhood. She referenced the grocery incident, her son's involvement, and the previous HOA complaint. Her delivery was polished but desperate, each statement underscored by the fear of losing control. Yet the effect was counterproductive. Neighbors, aware of the subtle social dynamics at play, noticed the contrast between her agitation and my composed demeanor. Each word she spoke amplified the perception of overreach, entitlement, and panic rather than authority. As the meeting progressed, I allowed the community to see the reality for themselves. Every claim she made was carefully contextualized with calm explanations, highlighting misunderstandings, entitlement, and the social imbalance inherent in her accusations. I did not need to attack her character. Her actions spoke louder than any defense I could mount. Every polite correction, every factual clarification subtly shifted perception in my favor. Authority, silent and grounded, began to dominate the room. Neighbors who had been on the fence, those previously loyal to Karen or hesitant to challenge her, now began to engage subtly, offering observations and insights that supported reason and fairness. Some questioned the proportionality of her complaints, others referenced her own lapses in following HOA rules. Each intervention, quiet yet pointed, undermined her narrative, reinforcing the idea that entitlement, not authority, had driven her actions. The social balance was tipping, and Karen could feel it, even if she could not articulate why. Her son, present in the back of the room, watched silently. The shift in perception was not lost on him. His earlier assumptions about his mother's unchallengeable authority were crumbling. He witnessed firsthand how patience, composure, and strategic influence could outweigh volume, aggression, and formal complaints. The lesson was subtle but profound: true authority is earned, not demanded. Karen, sensing the tide turning, attempted one last escalation. She referenced HOA rules, the procedural framework, and the perceived threat of disruption. Her gestures became more dramatic, her tone louder, but the effect was diminishing returns. The board, polite yet perceptive, asked questions that highlighted inconsistencies and gaps in her claims. Every attempt to assert dominance through formal means only exposed her desperation. The neighborhood, long attuned to the subtleties of influence, began to see her unraveling in real time. I observed quietly, noting the subtle but decisive shifts. The room's energy was now aligned against Karen's narrative. Her formal complaints, once intended to weaponize bureaucracy, had become evidence of overreach and entitlement. Neighbors, empowered by observation and shared experience, began to engage more confidently, reinforcing my position without overt confrontation. The balance of power, previously tilted in her favor, had reversed completely. By late afternoon, Karen's composure faltered. Her voice wavered, gestures became erratic, and her words repeated without impact. Every action intended to intimidate now highlighted her vulnerability. The neighborhood, fully aware of the shift, watched with a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction. Social media cameras captured moments that would later circulate widely, documenting not just a petty HOA dispute, but a masterclass in strategic influence versus entitlement. The HOA board, recognizing the escalating tension and the undeniable shift in community perception, concluded the meeting with a neutral statement, emphasizing fairness, community cohesion, and the importance of mutual respect. Karen left the room visibly frustrated, her authority diminished, while the subtle acknowledgement of influence, my influence, was cemented. The social hierarchy, once unquestioned, had realigned through quiet strategy, observation, and composure. As evening descended, the neighborhood streets seemed quieter but charged with residual energy. Karen retreated to her home, consumed by frustration and reflection, while neighbors lingered in hushed conversations, reassessing dynamics and sharing their observations. The drama, once fueled by entitlement and bureaucracy, had resolved not through confrontation, but through perception, social alignment, and strategic patience. Her son, now visibly reconsidering past assumptions, observed the subtle power shift. Lessons had been learned, authority imposed without substance collapses under scrutiny, and entitlement, no matter how loudly asserted, cannot override calculated influence. The neighborhood, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, had been forever changed by the events that had started with a simple grocery dispute. By nightfall, the streets returned to their apparent calm. Lawns glimmered under lamplight, and homes radiated the quiet serenity typical of suburban life. Yet beneath the surface, the neighborhood's social fabric had shifted irreversibly. Karen's authority, once unquestioned, was fractured. My influence, built on patience, composure, and perception, had solidified. The climax of the HOA saga had concluded, leaving lessons etched in the quiet streets, whispered conversations, and the subtle acknowledgement of what it means to wield true influence. The chapter, and the story, closed on a neighborhood transformed. Authority, it had become clear, is not the loudest voice, nor the most aggressive presence. It is composed, calculated, and earned. Karen had learned this lesson the hard way. And the residents, witnesses to the unraveling and the quiet consolidation of influence, had seen firsthand that entitlement can provoke chaos, but strategic patience always prevails. The story ends here, with a community forever aware of the difference between power demanded and influence earned, leaving a lasting impression of social dynamics, strategy, and the subtle art of commanding respect.